Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your lunch, courtesy of the pit. And I would like to thank our culinary sponsor, Empire Eats. They were the provider of our breakfast and lunch, as well as the food you'll get this afternoon and evening at the reception at All Saints Chapel. I do want to make a note for the reception. Obviously, that'll start at 5:30. And based on, you got the email, but you can walk. The directions are about 2 blocks, or 3 blocks, and 3 blocks. Or you can drive. Parking is limited over there, but another lot opens up after 6 if you wanted to wait and get there after 6. But either way should be fine. We look forward to seeing you over there, where we'll have some great food, great company, and great music of North Carolina artists past and present. So on that note, before I turn it over to our illustrious speaker, I would like to introduce the SNCA Awards. And first, we have our Education Chair, Marlena Rose.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to present these awards. If you are here, if you could come up and I will hand you this award and we'll get a photo. If you're not here, we'll just move on. Okay. So first, the Education Committee is pleased to present the Jean J. Williams Student Paper Award to Emma Dingle. All right. And the Education Committee is also pleased to present the C. David Jackson Memorial Student Scholarship. We've got 2 of these. And the first will be to Kensington Laub. Congratulations.
Our own photographer. Shout out to State Archives.
All right, I have one more to present, another C. David Jackson Memorial Student Scholarship to Griffin Anderson. Congratulations, everyone.
And now I'd like to introduce our Development Chair, Shante Alvarez.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Development Committee, we are going to present we only had one application for the Michelle Francis Scholarship. So we're very happy to award this year's scholarship to Laura R. Silva. We are also presenting the Thornton W. Mitchell Award, which is the lifetime achievement version of award for SNCA. So I'd like to read just a little bit about the information that was submitted to me from the award winner's nominator. By the way, we are presenting the 2024 Thornton W. Mitchell Service Award to Martha Elmore. Yes. as Martha comes to the stage, I'll share what the nominator wrote. Martha has worked in special collections at East Carolina University's Joyner Library in different capacities since 1976, when she first began as a student worker. Presently, she serves as the manuscript archivist for the East Carolina Manuscript Collection. In her role, Mrs. Elmore has been vital to the success of our division's efforts to preserve the history of the people and region of Eastern North Carolina. Ms. Elmore has consistently fostered relationships with donors to better ensure that their materials are being cared for to the best of our abilities. Mrs. Elmore and her family are personally responsible for several collections and items that have been donated over the years, either personally by them or through working with individuals who are seeking homes for their historical artifacts. It is safe to say that the East Carolina Manuscript Collection would not be as rich a resource if not for the work and passion of Mrs. Elmore. She has also consistently served the archival profession by acting as a mentor, colleague, and friend for many archivists and cultural heritage workers throughout her time at ECU. Whether it be new employees or student interns, Mrs. Elmore has consistently offered guidance, professional training, and access to her vast institutional knowledge to ensure that all of us can do our jobs to the best of our capabilities. I truly believe that through her work, Mrs. Elmore has made a significant portion of the history of Eastern North Carolina and the institution of ECU's history available to the public. It is my honor as her colleague and friend to nominate her for this award that I truly think her body of work and dedication to North Carolina and the archival profession deserve. Let's celebrate again Martha Elmore.
And now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker for the SNCA 2024 annual meeting. Dr. Darin Waters is the Deputy Secretary of Archives and History here at the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, and he's also an Emeritus Distinguished Professor at UNC Asheville. Dr. Waters, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you all. It's good to be here with you today. Good afternoon. I'll tell you, the challenging time to talk to a group is right after lunch, right? Either before or right after, because if you're like me now, I'm ready to I had lunch upstairs, I'm ready to go to sleep. But I'm deeply grateful to be here with you, Josh. Thank you for that kind introduction. Where to start? That's the challenge. Some of you may know me. I did think that I had spoken to this group when I was a professor at UNC Asheville. It's been so long ago. So if some of you hear something that I said then, forgive me for that, for repeating myself here. But thank you for having me. I think I'd like to start about, when I was a candidate for this position. My appreciation for the work that you all do on a daily basis to preserve the records that tell the story of who we are, and I hope give us a sense of who we want to be. And there I'm kind of playing off of two major questions that one of my former colleagues at UNC Asheville, still a very good friend of mine, that we were kind of asking this question over the course of these two questions over the course of a year. We did a podcast. You can get copies of that podcast. We did about 106 shows over the series of that podcast for Blue Ridge Public Radio while I was still at UNC Asheville. And the title of that show is called The Waters and Harvey Show. If you look it up on Google Play or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get you'll find copies of it. Did a series of shows with different people. Sometimes it was just Marcus and I, Dr. Marcus Harvey. He's now a professor down at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. But we would just have these conversations about why history is important. And we would talk about the processes of history, how history is actually done. Marcus is interesting. I wish he was here with me right now. We could kind of do a play off of each other. We have that type of relationship. But his background is religious studies, whereas mine is a historian, trained as a historian. And I say about Marcus that Marcus became a really good historian very quickly. I think that all of the academic, especially in the field of the humanities, has some connection to history. Everybody's doing history in some form of fashion, right? But Marcus would always say, you historians are just arrogant people. That's what he would say all the time, because you can, go through and list down all of the facts and all of these things. But it's not just about the facts, it's about how we interpret the facts as well. So I have developed a deeper appreciation now that I'm in this role of what you do on a daily basis. And when I was a candidate for this position, deciding to leave my professorship at UNC Asheville to take on this role, one of my predecessors, Dr. Jeffrey Crow, who some of you may know, Dr. Crow and I had been together for a long time because he was one of my professors when I was at North Carolina State University to do my master's degree there. And he very much encouraged me to move on to the PhD, which I did at Chapel Hill, working with none other than John Hope Franklin. John Hope Franklin was one of the professors. I have that distinction of being his last student, who he helped guide my work. I'd known Dr. Franklin for a long time. I had developed a relationship here with him when I lived here in Raleigh for 21 years, and he took a great interest in my interest in history. And so encouraged me to go to pursue the master's degree. I had been working as a probation parole officer, interesting job here for about 6 years before I decided to take on this new path in my life to pursue the master's. And Judy and I actually were in master's program at North Carolina State together, so we've known each other for quite some time. But it was quite intimidating to be a candidate for this position, and then sitting on the other side of the screen when I did the interviews by Zoom was none other than Dr. Crow, because they had hired him to actually guide the process of finding a new person for this position. So that was quite intimidating. But he did say to me, he said, I was glad you were interested in, being a candidate for this role. Now, one of the questions that I was asked when in those interviews, it's like, what area of the department or the Office of Archives or History would you think that you would probably be the weakest in? And it was, I said, the area of the archives. Because there's so many particulars about what you do, how you analyze records, what gets preserved, how you engage the community to collect records, all of these different things, because not everything, some of us feel like everything is absolutely important. And every single artifact or piece of paper that we have is important, but not all of it is. Sarah knows that I'm still kind of in this. Sarah Kuntz is, my colleague back there. She's back there in the back. She knows that I still get a little, maybe I'm less hyperactive about any time that we talk about deaccessioning any records, but early on, I was always a little hyperactive about that, and Sarah was willing to sit down and have a conversation with me about what the process is for deaccessioning records. Because as a historian, you're sitting there going, we've got to save, we've got to save, we've got to save, we've got to preserve. But I knew that this was the weakest area. There was a lot that I needed to learn, and I have learned a lot. I'm very grateful that I have someone like Sarah Kuntz to work with on a daily basis who knows the work of this area of the department. And she's back there. I don't want to put her on the spot, but I will say that when I have conversations with Secretary Wilson, we will always say, well, if everybody here was like Sarah, when it comes to division directors, because Sarah is right on point all the time. So I deeply appreciate Sarah. But I've gotten to learn to know a lot more as I've been in this role for the past 2.5 years. It's a little over 2.5 years, and know and hope that I will have the opportunity to get to learn even more as we move along, making it one of my priorities to make sure that Sarah Kuntz does not retire anytime soon. That's one of my big objectives on a daily basis. We've got to keep her here. Now, to go back to me and Marcus, I said, we, in that series of podcasts that we did, I guess it's been a couple of years now, time goes by so fast. We were asking those two questions: who are we? and who do we wish or want to be? You know, we're about to come to America 250. Sarah and her team are doing a great job in the planning of the activities for that. And I think it gives us an opportunity to ask those questions again, you know, about our founding ideals. Who is it that we say we want to be? And, you know, where do we want to go? You know, what are we doing to actually fulfill those ideas? So maybe those two questions can somewhat frame what I will say here today. Josh was very kind to ask me to come and talk with you all today. When I was doing my dissertation back in, again, you know, I had a birthday yesterday as well, and so I'm now at the point where my oldest son reminded me yesterday. He's like, "Dad, next year I will be 30." And I'm thinking, I can't believe that I'm going to have a son who's 30 years old. I'm still trying to hold on to the fact that I'm, maybe just 35 years old, I tell people. But alas, I am not. I am just amazed at how quickly time goes. So I finished my PhD in 2011. So it's hard to believe it's been that many years since I finished that. But Dr. Harry Watson, who co-chaired my dissertation committee with Dr. Franklin, said to me when I started to think about what I was going to write about for my dissertation. He said, you need to pick a topic that you can live with for a while. You're going to live with this and sit with it for a while. He said, I would say, 6, 7 years. Well, I've been living with it a lot longer than 6 or 7 years. The book is not done yet. The dissertation has been done. I am surprised to find out from people when I see them. Met someone the other day who was a candidate for another position we're interviewing for here. She's a professor at Warren Wilson College right now, and when we met with her, she said, I know your work very well. We've been using your dissertation to write about Western North Carolina as we're doing our work about the history of Western North Carolina, especially of people of color in that part of the state. And then she wrote a letter back, an email thanking me for the opportunity to meet here. And she said my students were excited to hear that I had actually met you because they're so familiar with your work. I'm amazed that dissertation has gotten as much attention as it has gotten. Normally dissertations are written, they go up on the shelf and they collect dust, right? But people have been pouring through this one, and it has been, it's been useful. It's been useful to people. I think, and Colin, who he and I have known each other, he knew me at UNC Asheville. Colin, I think, would confirm that as well of what that dissertation actually did to kind of generate this interest in studying the life of people of color in the western part of our state. It played a huge role in that, and that research is just growing by leaps and bounds as we speak. But I never thought that would have happened. But Dr. Watson told me you need to pick a topic that you can live with for a while. So I've been living with this for a while, so you'll forgive me that I started to think to myself, I've done so many talks that will talk about essentially what is a family story. It's a family history. You see the name here, Isaiah Rice. Colin's going to know that name very well, but Isaiah Rice was my grandfather, died in 1980. I'm sitting here thinking about that. I had my birthday yesterday. He was a man who I was extremely close to. If anyone had told me when I was growing up that he could walk on water, I would have believed you that he could do that. He was this kind of Renaissance man. He could do everything. At least it seemed to me. He was a classical and jazz pianist. You'll find out a little bit here in a few minutes that he was also a photographer, quite good photographer, which I didn't know about. I knew he did that work. But he was just this great man, but he died unexpectedly on June 19th, 1980. I think my mother is still surprised that I can remember the date and almost the time. He was teaching me piano. I had my second lesson with him on June 17th, 1980, and then he dies unexpectedly 2 days later. So talking about him in some ways is kind of emotional. It gets emotional for me because I was so close to him, but I was 13 years old, and that was a time when he thought, okay, you're 13, you're a teenager now, there are more things that we can do, and we were starting to kind of think about other things to kind of explore. So I still feel, you can probably sense here now that I still feel the loss of him deeply. But I guess what precipitated my writing for my dissertation about Western North Carolina, the title of my dissertation was Life Beneath the Veneer, the Development of the African American Community in Asheville and Western North Carolina from 1793, I think, all the way to 1900. I stopped in 1900 because you had to stop somewhere, with this thing. But the bulk of that dissertation focuses on the post-Civil War period and looking at the development of community. Now, what precipitated that was that I got tired of people telling me that there were no people of color, no black people in Western North Carolina. People would say that to me all the time. I told a story about my first visit here. My first day on my job as a probation parole officer here in Raleigh, and my boss was a woman named Jewel Edwards Dunn. Her father was a prominent figure in the state legislature, has served in the House and then in the Senate. He finished his career in the Senate. He was also the pastor of one of the largest churches, African-American churches in Fayetteville. And Dr. C.R. Edwards was his name. But I remember the first day on the job, Jewel says to me, "Darin, where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Asheville." And she just looked at me, "There are no black people in Asheville." I'm like, well, I knew my family history. I'm like, look, well, I do exist. This is when you start looking in the mirror, so am I really here? But you would hear this all the time. You hear it from people constantly. Well, no, and you go to Western North Carolina, these small little communities, you don't see a lot of people of color. I think that's beginning to change, and it has a lot to do with this kind of renaissance that is happening around the pursuit and the study of the history of people in that region, not only in the region of Western North Carolina, but I think in all of Southern Appalachia. There's an explosion of work going on. You've probably heard of this kind of movement, the Afro-Appalachia Artist Project, and all of the work that's going on. I like to think that I played some part in helping to fuel that interest. But that was what drove my interest in my dissertation. Now, I love Asheville. I was born and raised there. My great-grandfather, Lewis Waters, who I'll say a little bit about in a minute, was born in 1860. For a while, we thought that he had been born right there in Western North Carolina because, me trying to do the genealogical research, I'm not good at doing that stuff. That's a special field in and of itself. I'm learning that now. But I've had the help of Biltmore Estate. I think when I spoke in Asheville, I noticed there were members from Biltmore Estate's archives that were there. Is there anyone from Biltmore here? No. Okay, good. I don't want you to think that what I'm going to say about Biltmore is a commercial for Biltmore Estate, but I have a great relationship with the folks at Biltmore. But Biltmore has kind of helped me dig a little bit deeper into the family history, and they had a purpose for doing that, which I'll mention in just a few minutes. But anyway, I thought that the Waters family, had at least been in the region in the 1850s, but that's not true. The family originates from Spartanburg County, South Carolina. But my great-grandfather, Lewis Waters, was born in 1860, the year before the Civil War starts. The Waters family is interesting in that it is, my branch of it, is somewhat old and young at the same time. My grandfather, Edgar Waters, Sr., waited until he was 42 years old to get married to my grandmother, who I think was nearly 20 years younger than he was. So at 42, he gets married, and they proceed to have 10 kids, right? And then my dad is the oldest of those 10. So he told me, about I would ask him about his grandfather, and who I knew lived in Edneyville, North Carolina, which is in Henderson County. If you know the western part of the state, Edneyville is apple country. So he was an apple farmer. You go out there recently, I think just before I moved back down here to Raleigh, I went out to Edneyville just to kind of, tour the area. Did not realize that as a kid, I've been going out there all the time, and the road, one of the major thoroughfares, is named Waters Road, and it's named for Lewis Waters in Edneyville, North Carolina. Never knew that. It's about paying attention, right? You don't pay attention to these details. There's so many details of family history that I wish, are questions now that I wish I had asked, but I just did not ask them at the time. But by the time my father was born, in 1942, his grandfather had passed away. His grandfather passed away in 1930. And so he never knew his grandfather. And so he didn't ever talk about him that much. Never said anything about him. I only knew the name. His grandmother had also passed away. So there wasn't that connection that he had with them. He didn't know him. And so we knew little about him. And so I'm thinking to myself, you know, born in 1860 in Western North Carolina, we know what Western North Carolina looks like, especially after the Civil War is over. A key book to read on this would be not only Richard Starnes, who's the provost at Western Carolina University. We got a note from him today, but he's a historian from Asheville. He's written about the land of the sky, the development of tourism in that area. And then there's also another author, Nan Chase, who has written about Asheville and its development. She talks about what the region looked like after the Civil War. It's like if it was isolated before the war, which it really wasn't. It was a little bit more connected than we think. It was very isolated after the war was over. So, it made me think about, was my great-grandfather even educated? You could be a property owner, be successful, and not necessarily be educated. Being born in 1860, I would have questioned, and I doubted that. Let's just put it that way. I doubted it. But what happens if we fast forward to me doing this research and deciding to take this on? And I'll say here, and the reason why I said I love Asheville, I do, but I think everybody wants to leave their hometown, right, and go live somewhere else. I'm no different. That's exactly what I wanted to do. There was no desire to go back to Asheville to live. My thing was, well, what am I going to do there? I want to go to the big city. So when it comes to Raleigh, stay in Raleigh. And so I tell people, if I had known that my dissertation was going to take me back to Asheville to live for 11 years as a professor at the university, I would have written a different dissertation. Now, don't tell anybody in Asheville that I said that. But it's true at the particular time. But some people never leave their home. I marvel at people who do that, and they stay. My parents are case in point of that. They've always been in Asheville. But it did turn out to be a really beneficial experience for me to go back to Asheville and live as an adult, to experience the place as an adult in a very different way. So I was able to engage the community in a different way. So now I'm very glad that I actually wrote that dissertation. So you see, storytelling is what we're doing here. As I drove in this morning, I thought about that, things to say. I've talked so much, and I was going to say that I've talked about this experience that I had going back to Asheville so much that sometimes I start listening to myself when I get up to speak to groups who ask me to speak about it, and I'm thinking, no one can be interested in this because I'm tired of hearing myself talk about it, right? But I'm grateful that people are interested in hearing about these stories, so I try to keep that out of my mind. I think my colleagues here at the department are starting to figure out what my colleagues at UNC Asheville knew about me, that I get stuck on certain things and I just stick with it and just hang on. Let me say about Sarah again, I had to give a talk for Halifax Resolves Day, and I ended up reading, and if you haven't, she'll probably say after this is over that everybody's going to be asking for her speech, but it was a remarkably good speech that she gave last year there. And I read that speech, and I walked away from it going, what can I go to Halifax and actually say that she didn't say, and it make it interesting. It was really good about what we were planning for America 250. But Sarah knows that I have become a very big student of Alexis de Tocqueville. All right, she's laughing back there right now. And Sarah actually quoted Alexis de Tocqueville in that speech the year before me. I just didn't tell anybody that when I quoted Alexis de Tocqueville last time. But we had different quotes, I'll say that. But there's certain people who kind of frame my philosophical thinking about history, why history is important, why the collection of the information are the records and the documents that we can work from that we go to actually write that history is so key and so important. And there are three people really who kind of frame this philosophical thinking for me. One is Edmund Burke, 18th century political philosopher and politician, Irishman by descent, but served as a member of Parliament in England. There's a quote by Burke that I think is fundamentally important, and I'll just kind of lay that out here for you to think about here for just a few minutes as I move through this. But this is what he said. He said, society is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are dead and those who are to be born. Russell Kirk, who is one of my other favorite writers, former historian, late historian, Russell Kirk, has referred to this quote from Burke too, and he has used the line that we participate in this great historical continuity. Right? We're building on each other. And the only way that we can build is to know what the people before us have actually had to say, to pay some attention to what they have had to say. When I used to teach my humanities class, Humanities 324, The Modern World at UNC Asheville, I would start that class out every year with two things. One was a talk that, I'm not going to remember his name, but the former head of the National Endowment for the Humanities in the Obama administration, he gave a talk, a series of conversations across the country around civility and learning to be civil with each other and have civil conversations. I would start that class out by showing that interview that he did with Idaho State TV. It was a remarkable interview. But I also had them read a speech that was given by the former president of Duke University, Dr. Richard Broadhead. And I don't hold the fact that he was the president of Duke University against him. I am a Carolina person. I bleed Carolina blue through and through. But it was a good speech, and it was called The Power of the Humanities, the Fire That Never Dies. And you can go look this up. It was a great speech that he gave for the North Carolina Humanities Council in talking about the importance of the humanities, which, in a way, the archives helps to fuel what happens in that side of the academic world. Fueling the humanities is there. We come to the archives to do that work. But he talked about his time of traveling through deep Mississippi and just seeing the evidence, the artifacts of people, houses, that had, some that had fallen apart, but looking deeply at the houses and seeing people's names etched on windows, right? He said that was like their way of saying, I was here, and I was a real person, and I had an existence in life. When I go to the records and the archives, that's what they speak and they say to me. And I think that's what they say to so many other people. And that is why what we do to collect and preserve the records becomes so fundamentally important. Now, people have stuff hidden away in spaces. There's some remarkable stuff out there. So this is going to turn me to my own family story. So I told you a little bit about Edgar Waters, and I'll say maybe three things. If there are three things that you'll get from this, they would be this, the power of storytelling. And I thought about, well, what influences storytelling? It's having an archive to go to find the stories, right? One, the collection of documents. But things that have influenced my ability to think about stories and maybe tell stories is, number one, you have to be a good listener. I'm not doing any listening up here right now, but, listening to people. Dr. Franklin said that to me. He's like, Darin, you need to learn to listen to people. You will be amazed at what you discover if you just sit and listen and let people talk. I marvel at people who sometimes are near the end of life. I had this experience with my grandmother, Geraldine Rice, about a week before she passed away. And there's a story I can tell about her. Recently, she reappeared in full force with me when I went to do a talk just recently about Thomas Wolfe in Asheville for the Asheville-Buncombe County Library. The team there, the archivists there came up to me and they said, "Oh, we found something that we didn't even know existed back in our archives. It is an interview that was done with your grandmother back in 2003, the year before she died." And they said, "We didn't know it was back there, but one of our archivists found it, and we wanted to bring it to you." I had a chance to sit upstairs and listen to her just talk. You know, hadn't heard her voice since 2004 when she passed away. So it was amazing to sit up there and just listen to her talk about some things that are quite relevant to where we are right now. I was very surprised. You know, a community that was threatened because of the expansion of a highway, their community in Asheville, the Burton Street community, which is one of the historic African-American communities in Asheville, but was threatened by the expansion of the I-26 connector there, and she was very concerned about that. And she was talking about that, and there was a question from the person who did the oral interview to her. They said, "Well, you know, we're thinking about the other side of the highway." And they said, "Well, why aren't they talking about taking some of the houses and property on the other side of the highway?" And she said, "Well, we've gone to community meetings, and they've told me," this is me listening to her upstairs, and she said, "and they've told us that they can't do that because the Charles B. Aycock School is over there, and it's a historic school." I just let that just sit. It's a part of some of the conversations we're having now. Right? But it was interesting to hear her saying that in 2003. But as a kid, I didn't talk to her about those things. But just to hear her be historically conscious, the way that she was about her own community and valuing it, it made me wish that I had spent more time listening to her or asking her questions, right? So listening, I did have the experience with her. I went to Asheville to see her a week before she passed away and just sat with her for 2 hours and just started asking questions. I didn't tape it. I was writing it all down. I still have that written. It's a part of my archives, thinking that I will do something with it at some point, but just writing down. And I did say to her after it was over, I apologized because I thought it had exhausted her. By that time, she was bedridden because she was suffering from cancer. And she actually said to me, she said, "No," she said, "I really needed to do this." She said it was somewhat cathartic, that she needed to just get it out. I think it was about, you know, she needed to be able to share her human experience, if that makes sense. I hope I'm saying something here that resonates with you with this. So listening, and also asking questions, just being curious. You'll find out in a second here. I'm trying to take my time here, Josh. Josh told me I had about an hour, which, you know, and so asking questions, being curious. I got into this curious moment with my other grandmother, Darin Waters, my dad's mother, born in 1923. She died in 2008. And just before she was put in a permanent rest facility, nursing facility, and I happened to ask her one day, I said, "Grandma, did you know my grandfather's, she had talked about her parents. I knew who her parents' names were, Lafayette Logan and Eliza Logan. I knew that my great aunt, who passed away, 3 months ago at 103, you know, there were pictures of Lafayette Logan and Eliza Logan at their house down in Rutherford County. And so she would talk about her family, but grandfather never did. You know, I spent a lot of time with my grandfather, but he just never talked that much about his parents. And I tell people all the time, my grandfather, while I had a lot of time with this other grandfather, Edgar Waters Sr., that I remember him as just this funny man. He was born in 1897, right? So, and he had seen so much over the course of his life. And I think the humor that came with him was a part of the way that he got through some of the struggles that they had gone through as he was living his life. And so I didn't ask him about his father or his mother, but I just happened to ask my grandmother one day. I said, "Did you know his parents?" She said, "Oh yeah, I knew him." She said, "And there's a picture of him right there in the hall." Like, really? Yes, I'm looking. I'm like, then I see this portrait that was done of the two of him and my great-grandmother. And I'm going, as a kid, I've been passing by not knowing who these people were, but then finally asked her that question, and she says, look, there they are right there. And she said to me, she said, so if you promise to take care of it, I'm going to give you the portrait. So I have it. Now, if you go to Biltmore Estate now, you will see that portrait because it's at Biltmore Estate. And here's the reason why. So when I started the research, Dr. Franklin, and I will say to a large degree, Harry Watson as well, were okay with me taking on the research topic that I wanted to take on about African Americans in Western North Carolina. But the other members of my dissertation committee were skeptical. And they said, we don't think you're going to be able to pull this off and do it. And the reason why is you're not going to find the records to do it. They're just not there. You're not going to find the records to support it. I mean, it was hard. You know, you've got to do that dissertation proposal where you've got to say, okay, I'm going to go to this archive, I'm going to go to that archive. And I listed all of them. Dr. Franklin was the person on the committee saying, let him do what he wants to do. And no one was going to challenge John Hope Franklin. They just weren't. You know, it was an interesting experience. People would say to me all the time, tell everybody who's on your dissertation committee. I say, Dr. Franklin, like, oh, you know you already have your PhD, right? No one's going to challenge him. So Dr. Franklin, you know, kind of put his foot down and said, okay, let him do what he wants to do. Well, unbeknown to me, I didn't even think about Biltmore Estate as a possible place to go. It was not on my radar screen at all. But I ended up getting connected, and this is how this department becomes important. I'm coming back and forth to the department, to the archives here all the time doing my research. There are many people here that I've had a relationship with for a long time. That was the gist of what I knew really of your work. Sarah will tell you that when my first day here and I met with Sarah, the first thing I told her I wanted to do is I said, I'm going to be a kid today. I want to go behind the archive door, right, to go into the stacks. And she said, well, it's not really anything back there. There's all of that, you know, fascinating. But that door, I just had to get behind that door. So Sarah takes me back there. But I had been coming here all the time. So Ansley Wegner, who works here, I'd known Ansley for a long time. Chris Minkins, Chris and I went to school. We all went to school together. Earl Imes, I've known Earl for a long time. So I feel like I'm with family here on a daily basis, people who I've known for a long time, but never knew that I would be here in this role and in this capacity. But the gist of what I knew about what the work that you do was coming in here asking for the records, right? But I knew that they were few and far between, even out in Asheville, few and far between. But Michelle Lanier, another person who I've known for a long time, head of our state historic sites, Michelle and I had known each other for a long time, and she came to me one day when I was here in the archives working diligently on this dissertation. What a process. Anybody who's been through that process knows. I mean, it's just, you just have to, first you take a vow of poverty, and secondly, you just got to trudge through it. So Michelle said, look, Darin, I have talked to a guy out in Asheville with an organization called the YMI, the Young Men's Institute, which I knew very well. My parents, you know, had been connected with the YMI. It's located in the one of the historic African-American communities in Asheville, the East End community. You go up there today, the building of the YMI, it still exists, probably has the distinction of being the oldest freestanding Black cultural center in the country. And she said, well, the executive director there talked to me. His name is Harry Harrison, and he's interested in doing a history. By that time, the YMI was, I think, 115 years old. It was about to hit its 115th anniversary. No one had ever written that history. It's an organization that was created specifically for the African-American community there. And she said, because you're writing about Asheville, I'm figuring it's going to figure prominently in your dissertation. I said, it is. She said, well, let me connect you with Harry. She said, because he's interested in maybe collaborating with you to kind of explore the history of that institution. I said, okay. Call Harry. Harry and I didn't know each other. We developed a great relationship. He's another person who I owe the fact that I was able to finish a PhD, my dissertation PhD to. I owe him a lot. Harry passed away shortly after I did finish, successfully finished my dissertation. But I went up to meet with Harry, and I walk into the room at the YMI, and there were executives from Biltmore Estate who were there. I'm thinking, why are they here? You know, why are these folks here? And they said, well, we want to talk about how we might collaborate with you all to do whatever project you're seeking to explore. They were open to doing that. And they then did ask Harry, they said, well, what would you like for us to do? And Harry said, I would like for you to give him access to your archives. Thinking, first of all, they've got an archive. Secondly, I started thinking they're probably not going to do that, right? Because my dissertation was going to be dealing with issues of race, right? And it can get very sensitive. And Biltmore is very, very protective of its brand. It's very protective of its brand. And so I was thinking, probably not going to happen. I've heard the stories. Some of you have probably heard the stories. The story of R.J. Reynolds is one of those stories. In fact, Dr. Watson was reminding me of that when I was doing this research that, you know, R.J. Reynolds had hired a historian to actually do a history of that company, but they were finding some of those records that, you know, really questioned some of the things they were doing, and then they decided to suppress that research for years. Another thing that happens, you know, can happen out there, the suppression of research and data and archival data. So I was thinking, they're probably not going to do this. Well, after the meeting was over, about 2 hours go by, and then they called and they said, we'll give him access. That kind of put me, I was surprised by this. That put me on the radar screen of UNC Asheville because they were trying to figure out who is this person that has gotten access to Biltmore's archives, because they didn't do that. I was one of the first people that they let in from the outside. Colin knows this story, to come in and actually do research there. And I still waited, you know, for a while. This was probably a part of my not really wanting to go up to Asheville. I was hoping I could do most of the research here and not have to go up there and do much there. But I finally decided to go after about 3 months. And what made it even more exciting when I got there was that the archives were in the house. Right. So I spent like 6 months working in the back corridors of Biltmore House going through their records. Well, my first day there, and that'll turn me to, that is my grandfather there. I may come back to him in a few minutes. I'm jumping around here. You'll forgive me for this. My first day at Biltmore, in their archives, just talking with their archivist, who was Suzanne Durham at the time. Suzanne and I were just talking about family history. And she said, well, tell me a little bit about your family history. I said, well, it goes back to this point in time in this region. And I mentioned my great-grandfather's name, Darin Waters, and she said, wait a minute. She said, I think I've seen that name in our records, in our database somewhere. She said, let's just do a search, and let's just see what we find. And I'm thinking, there's no way there's any connection with Biltmore Estate. I mean, at that time, I didn't really realize that Biltmore was 100 in its original form, total about 125,000 acres. So it goes all the way over into Henderson County and into Transylvania County. In fact, I recently told my parents, I said, do you know there's a mountain that's right behind him? As kids, we would go up to, there's a big reservoir up there. You get up to the reservoir, and I said, there's a huge fence up there that says property of Biltmore Estate. I said, it comes all the way around there. Like, we didn't know that. But this was a huge estate. But I still was thinking, why would there be any connection? I've never heard anybody in my family say that. She said, well, let's just do a search. We did a search in their database. 3 hits come back immediately. Go to the archives, go to the stacks. I'm working back there in the stacks, right? It was fun to be back there with all of the records and everything. It's something about the smell and the feel and everything. It just feels so good. It's just, you know, in fact, when I did a presentation like this for a group in Washington, D.C., one guy, after it was over, said, man, it sounded like Indiana Jones, like you're kind of crawling through all of this stuff. And it was just fun, you know, being back there. So we go into the stacks, we pull out 3 boxes, go through the files, and lo and behold, what do I find on my very first day at Biltmore Estate but 3 handwritten letters from my great-grandfather. So me saying, I don't know if he's even educated, find out he's an educated man. He had a team of people who were helping to remove debris from the estate when the house was being built. Then later on, as Biltmore has done deeper research into his story, he stayed there for a while, probably how he earned the money that eventually he used to buy the apple orchard, which part of the family still owns the apple orchard today in Edneyville. So this kind of opened up a whole new vista for my family about this family history. And it's amazing to talk to family members now who know the story. So Biltmore has done something that I think is great and that we're doing here. Sarah knows it. We talked a little bit about, we're talking about this morning. We've been talking about it for weeks, about the commitment of our current administration to making sure that we're expanding the stories that we're telling. And to be able to tell those stories, it means about collecting the information that's necessary to tell those stories. So it all kind of connects, it works together. And this is a major push on the part of our current secretary, Reed Wilson, to make sure we want to broaden the stories that we're telling more stories. Well, Biltmore was doing the same thing. Biltmore decided, as they were digging into some of the stories of the unknown stories of people who had helped to do the heavy lifting and work of building the house rather than the big names like the Richard Morris Hunts. You know, those stories are still there. We know those stories. Those are stories that usually get prioritized above all of the unsung heroes, so to speak. They decided they were going to completely revamp their permanent exhibit about the building of the house. And it opened just maybe a year and a half ago, and you will see that Lewis Waters and Emma Waters, their photograph is there. So you will see it when you get to the Halloween room of Biltmore. That permanent exhibit is there. But this is not the only story that is there. There are multiple stories of people that you didn't know about who were doing that heavy lifting every day. And it was amazing just to be there when they actually opened this exhibit. Now, this is a picture of me with my oldest son, Jonathan. I don't have a picture of my younger son, but my younger son is actually named for his great-great-grandfather, Lewis Waters. His name is Lewis. You know, I have to say here, I was with him yesterday. He came over to see me, wanted to take me to get something to eat for my birthday yesterday. He lives here. The oldest one now lives in Florida. But it was the funniest thing to take him over to the cemetery and then to see his name on an actual tombstone. It was like, that's mean to do, right? That's mean to do. But I did do that to him. But this is the image here that my grandmother, Lena Waters, gave me. Said, if you take care of it, it needed some restoration work. Biltmore restored it. They restored the frame. They did all of these things to be able to because I was able to share it with them. They said to me when they called me over, and this was just before I left, about maybe 6 or 7 months before I left Asheville to come back down here to take this job. And so they called me over and said, we're wondering if you will be willing to work with us to revamp the entire exhibit about the building of the house to tell these stories. One of the prominent stories there is a man named Sylvester Owens, who worked for the estate for a long period of time. And someone recently asked me, they said, did you know? I said, yeah, Mr. Owens lived right across the street from me. And I said, we all knew who Mr. Owens was because his niece was Frida Payne. And Frida would come to sing the great blues and jazz and singer who's still living out in California, but we all as kids knew when Frida was coming to town every year, she would come to visit her uncle. And I said, so yeah, I knew who he was, you know, and Frida is this very beautiful woman, you know, still is, and so all of us were fascinated by the fact that, you know, Frida Payne was coming to town. But it was amazing. They said when they invited me over to consult on this project, they said, when you told us that you had this image of your great-grandparents, they said you couldn't see our mouths because we were all at that time wearing masks. They said, but our jaws kind of hit the ground that you have it. And it was only because I had that curious question of asking my grandmother, did she know who they were? And then she told me. But otherwise, I don't know that we would know where this photograph would be now, but it's now prominently on display. My uncle, my dad's younger brother, Michael Waters is his name. Michael is more like a brother to me than he is an uncle because he's only 9 years older than me. But Michael and his wife, my Aunt Linda, live in Charlotte. And he said this was about a conversation I had with him about 8 or 9 months ago. He called me, he said, I got to tell you something. He's like, I can tell you something, Doc. He always calls me Doc now. He's like, I got to tell you something. He said, some people who just moved here from Texas and moved into our community came up the street, knocked on the door, and so they know us, and they said, we know your last name is Waters. We were just at Biltmore, and we did a tour of the estate, and we came down to this exhibit, and we saw the name Waters. is there any connection, any relation? And he said that he took so much pride in telling them, yes, that was my grandfather. And he said they were saying, oh, we have goosebumps from just hearing that story, right? Just the power of story and what you discover. And I have here just, a couple of the images. That's the photograph of Lewis and Emma Waters. I have it now. And that is, as a kid, my father, I'm the son of a now retired Baptist minister, but for a long time, my father pastored the church that Lewis and Emma helped found in Edneyville, North Carolina. And I knew as a kid the church, I would go there, and I knew where my great uncle lived in the old family home, but I just didn't know the street. And it was just going over and saying, I know the general direction, but let me see if I can find it. And then I get out there and I discover that the street is named Waters Street. Not even my dad knew that. I'm amazed at the things that we don't know. We're back. Am I boring you to death here yet? And I'll try to stop in a few minutes. How much time do I have?
About 17 minutes left.
Okay. Let me go real quick. Isaiah Rice. So, this is interesting. My grandfather, the other grandfather, you'll see here, we've done a major essay. UNC Press is wanting us to do a book on him. I think my mother is still amazed by the fact that she can go on to, she has the Google thing in her house, and she'll ask it questions. And I told her to ask it who Isaiah Rice is. And then it starts running down. He was a photographer, this and that, and she's like amazed by that. So there's a whole Wikipedia page on Isaiah Rice now because of the work that I was able to do around his work while I was there. This was another part of a piece of the thing that I would never imagine I would have done when I went back to Asheville. What I knew as a kid that he had taken photographs. So the title of the essays you'll see there is Between the Color Lines with a Spy Camera. And it's in Southern Culture. So we published this, I guess, I'm trying to look at the date on this, 2017. It's hard to believe it's 2017 when we published the essay. I worked with Gene Hyde, who is the archivist at UNC Asheville, and another professor there, Ken Betzalel, to do this essay. I just haven't had time to go back and do any more with it since then. It's one of my favorite pictures of my grandfather. And one of the things about his collection of photographs is what I regret is because he was always taking the photos. There are no photographs of us with him. He's not in any of the pictures. It's rare that you actually get a picture of him. But you can see just a stand-up type of guy. I mean, he was, let's put it this way, and the more stories that I hear about him, the more I realize he had a pretty good ego on him too, And see, the story is that he was in Europe. He was a World War II vet. And I'll go here. One of the things that we were able to find is his draft card, which tells us so much about what he was doing. My mother didn't know that he had worked for, he was a part of the Works Progress, working in that area during the Depression. She did not know that. And some of the things that she was able to just glean from this. His records with the United States military are part of those records in Kentucky that were destroyed in a fire. Not all of his were destroyed. They were partially destroyed. But they're going through a restoration process again, and I'm anxiously waiting when we can get into seeing what is there, because we're trying to figure out how did he even learn to take these pictures? What did he do? It's interesting about so many war veterans, they don't talk about what they did. He never talked about it. I asked my mom, did he talk about his time in the military? She's like, no, he never did. The only story that I know about him in the military is in Europe, and someone sends him his high school yearbook from the school that he graduated from, Stevens Lee High School, which was the African-American school, and there was a girl in there that he saw a picture of, and he told his friends, when I go back to Asheville, I'm going to find her, and I'm going to marry her. He did that. Geraldine Rice is the person that he interviewed. My grandmother was a beautiful, beautiful woman. When she died in 2004, there was another man that was outside the funeral home waiting for permission to go in when we went to just clear everything. And he was there, and he was just in tears and everything. And my dad, when he came out, he asked my mom, who was that? She said, oh, that was who she was engaged to before he came back to Florida. So he kind of looks like he'd do something like that, right? But here, here's something. So the photographs, let me just say about the photographs. I could run you through a collection of these photos of Asheville. James Ferguson, that name may ring a bell to some of you. James Ferguson, along with our current Attorney General's father, Josh Stein's father, and Julius Chambers, the former chancellor of North Carolina Central University, they formed what was essentially the first integrated law firm in the state of North Carolina. And it's interesting to talk to James Ferguson. He's told me now to call him Fergie, but I won't. I told him I'll only call him Fergie if my mother is nowhere around. Because interestingly, James lives in Charlotte. He's 82 years old now. I know that because Dad is 82 years old. He and Dad are high school classmates. And James Ferguson and James Ferguson's father and my grandfather, Isaiah Rice, were best friends in Asheville. See, there are black people in Asheville. Were best friends and sang in a quartet together. So there's a deep, deep family history here. So I talk to James Ferguson all the time. But I got to know him while I was doing the research, and he did tell me, he said, Darin, when I went down to Charlotte to see him, someone said, you've got to go see James Ferguson, talk to him about Asheville. He'll give you kind of the lay of the land. James was a part of a group there called A-Score, which was the high school student group that helped to integrate Asheville. He helped form that group. And I went to see him down in Charlotte, was sitting in his office, and he said, you really have to take on this project because no one else has done what you're trying to do. This is the way you're going to get all of the other things that will happen is to do this work, to get into the records to find out what the story is. But to get there, I knew that my grandfather, Isaiah Rice, had been taking photographs all his life. But he died in 1980. My grandmother never really touched the collection again. It was just in her house. It was just there. She passed away, my mother inherited it. And I kept trying to talk to my mom about it. I just wanted to see the pictures. I talked to my grandmother not long before she had passed away about my grandfather and his photography. And she did say to me, she said, Darin, she said, everybody has vices. Taking photographs was your grandfather's. And she said, I decided to live with that. Because as we dug into the history of it, he was spending quite a bit of money on photography. The cameras that he had, Gene Hyde at UNC Asheville kind of looked at what he would have been spending because you've got to send your photographs over to, some of them we see that he was sending them over to Germany to actually be developed. He was buying cameras from Germany, all of these different cameras. I have most of the cameras that he used. My mother gave me the cameras, but there's only one of them that she won't give me now that I really, really want. But he was driving around Asheville just taking photographs. One was with this little spy camera. I want to see here if I can, there it is. It's the spy camera. It's no bigger than a stick of gum. Some of you may have seen a camera like this. I remember he would carry it on his side, on his belt. And I didn't know what it was, but he was just driving through Asheville, snapping from time to time pictures. Some of the pictures are set. He would set people and do pictures. But I have this camera. The one that I really want is this one. And that's the one she won't let me have. She, in fact, there was an exhibit of his work in Asheville for a while. Some of the pictures are still exhibited up there. But we did a full exhibit, and she allowed us to have this camera for the exhibit. Then I took everything, when we took the exhibit down, and I took it to Gene, to carefully, package it together to hold it in the archives. Now, I had a reason for doing that. What I was trying to do is, Mom, it's safe, it's safe, it's safe. But boy, lo and behold, when I got ready to leave Asheville, she wanted to know, where's that camera? And I was thinking I was going to get to bring it back with me. No such luck. But the photographs, let me just go through and just show you some of them. One of the pictures that Gene, the special who's over special collections at UNC Asheville would like to use in his presentations of Asheville. He would like to use this picture. This is not one of my grandfather's pictures. It's one of a huge collection of photographs at UNC Asheville. The E.M. Ball collection. I got that right. Colin knows. It's a huge collection of photographs, a white photographer who took many pictures of Asheville. But what's unique about this picture, and the reason why Gene likes it, was because if you look at it very closely, you can't see it. You might be able to see, but it's a picture of Patton Avenue, and you see the people here, but if you look closely, there are these ghostly images. There's one here, and then there's another one somewhere, but they're very ghostly images of African Americans. But they're ghostly, almost invisible. But if you don't look at the picture closely, you don't see them. And that was part of what I was trying to get to in the work that I was doing with the dissertation, to bring African Americans center stage in the life of the city. Well, then we discover my grandfather's photo collection, which is exactly what you've got. People go to Asheville now, and they will say, people will say, where are the African Americans here? People, Asheville is a different, how do I want to put this? People kind of stay to themselves. Urban renewal, we've heard what urban renewal did to so many communities across not only the state, but the Southeast. Asheville experienced one of the largest urban renewal projects that had happened in the Southeastern, and it displaced a lot of people. And right now, you probably have heard that recently, they're going through this whole conversation about reparations and everything there in Asheville, trying to figure out how do we rectify some of the past harm that was done. Well, you go there, it's the reason why I would get the question, or get the comment that there are no African Americans in Asheville or Western North Carolina. My colleague Tracy Burns upstairs, she'll say, yeah, you're just one of the 5 that are there. But jokingly say that, but it's because you didn't see people there. Now, if you go back to my grandfather's photos, this one was taken in 1960. The photographs, his photo collection, which is about nearly 2,000 photographs in that collection at UNC Asheville. Now, they give you a very different look of Asheville and Western North Carolina. In fact, when my mother finally allowed the photographs to be digitized, it was great to see how they did this, how you all do your work. Because my mom was very uncomfortable with this. She was extremely uncomfortable. She just called me one night and she just said, I'd been begging her for a while, Mom, let's take a look at the pictures. And finally she called me just out of the blue one night. She said, come over and look at the pictures. And I hurried over there so we could start looking at these things. And she's going through them. She's like, first of all, she said, I have no idea what your grandfather was doing here. I don't know who these people are. And so she had been, and I tell this story because she's not around. I wouldn't tell if she was around, but she was tossing pictures out. She said, I don't know who these are. I'm like, Mom, you can't do that because it tells us a story. But Gene and his team at the archives there was so delicate and careful with these photographs. They digitized them all. Then they put them in these protective sleeves. Everything was kind of categorized in boxes, and then we were able to deliver it all back to her. And she was amazed when we did that. And she was thankful that we ended up doing it. Now these are available to scholars to actually take a look at, and you get a whole different feel of Asheville. That's another picture of my grandfather. Asheville. Just run through it. Asheville. This is right in the heart of Passway. This photograph here was used. People were amazed to see this. If you know Asheville, Pritchard Park, all of these African-American students, young people walking through, you do not see this now if you go to Asheville, but you see a very different place. But it's across the color line because they had friends, white friends, Jewish friends, everybody was kind of welcome in their home. So he was constantly taking photos. I put this one in. I love this photograph here. If you know my mom loved my mom to death, but she does not like taking pictures. So we included this one in there. She's in this picture, and you probably know which one she is. She's the person who's looking away. She probably saw him, but she is right here. Some more of other different communities, and I'm amazed at how he's taking pictures in churches, right? Wow, and no one knows it, right? He's just snapping these photographs. This is in the historic Shiloh community, which was originally located on Biltmore Estate. near where the house was built. There's a whole history behind how that community was moved to the location it is today. It's the community that I grew up in. And being able to get into the records and see how that process actually unfolded, it completely upended the story I had been hearing all my life about how that actually occurred, how the community was moved. People were saying people were forced off the estate. It wasn't that. It was a mutual deal between the leaders of that community and George Vanderbilt to move it. Only if he would build the infrastructure for the new community, and the YMI was a part of that deal, which he actually funded. I love these two pictures, pictures of children. And if you look closely, I could go into detail about these pictures, but this community looks so completely different from what it looks like today because the highway divided the community. And that was part of what you hear my grandmother talking about in her oral history. These two little girls here, and I want to point out these two little girls because I was in Asheville just a couple of weeks ago, and I can now see the value of the work that I did while I was there that I would have never known. I mean, I had to kind of stretch myself too because I'm a late 19th, early 20th century historian. My grandfather's work is more mid to late 20th century, so I had to really stretch myself to kind of come up to speed with some of the things that were going on there, which he would have loved that I would have had to do anyway. But we ended up hosting a conference at UNC Asheville. I thought it was going to be a one-year symposium that we would do, turned into an 8-year conference that we did around African Americans in Western North Carolina and Southern Appalachia. And one year, there was an artist from Charlotte who was presenting there. She had been hired by the city of Asheville because they wanted to do this inclusive art project in the city. And she had brought images to the conference that she was displaying in one of the panel sessions that was done there. And Gene Hyde happened to be sitting there looking at these images, and he came over to me after it was over. He's like, Darin, do you recognize these two images? He's like, that's your grandfather's work. And we talked to the artist, and she said, oh, yeah, I didn't know that was your grandfather, but that was the inspiration that I had for how we developed this project. So if you go to Asheville now, right in the heart of downtown, in front of the municipal building and City Hall, is this project, this art project there, inspired by Isaiah Rice's work. And here's some more of his images. That's one of my favorite photos there. And that's one of my favorite photos of him, which I think depicts him very well, my grandfather, because my mom looked at that picture. She goes, I have no idea what he was doing, but I look at it as one of the first and early selfies, right? Because he's set up a camera and he shot the picture of himself, and that was done. I think he took that picture in 1948 is when he did that picture. But I guess I tell you all of this. This is what Josh asked me to do, to kind of work through this family history. This has actually been fun to do, to talk about it. Just to say, let me end by saying this. Sarah and I have talked about this, about building inroads into communities that have largely been left out of the archival collection process. And I know that you all are committed to changing that and doing it. And it takes time to do that work, right? Because you have to build trust. Because my mother was extremely apprehensive about even allowing these pictures to be digitized, even though she knew she was going to get them back. And even after I left UNC Asheville, she has said to me on a couple of occasions, had I known you were leaving, I would have never done this, because she gets really uncomfortable. There was one night I'll end with this story. I'm laying in bed, 10:30 at night, phone rings, and I look over and it's Mom. And I just said, okay, I can't do this tonight, because I knew what it was about, right? Because I had already gone on Facebook, and there is a group, an organization called Black Archives. Some of you may know it. They published a book, but they had gotten some of the images and they had put them up on Facebook. She's on Facebook all the time. I just marvel that she's better at Facebook than I am. And so she saw these photographs, and that was what the call was about. I called her the next morning, and she's like, Darin, did you see those pictures? What are those pictures doing on Facebook? I'm like, Mom, that's what we want people to do with them. Because then I talked to Gene Hyde later on. He said they got permission to do it. They credited Isaiah Rice as the one who was the photographer for the work. And he said the amazing thing is that people are now responding on Facebook and saying, I know who that is, and they're giving us names. It's like you're doing the crowdsourcing for all of these. These photographs have also played prominently in our Green Book project, the project that we did around the Green Book, because so many of the places that he photographed were places that were where people stayed when they were traveling, where African Americans stayed. So I'll end by just saying thank you for listening to me just kind of be cathartic here and just talk about family history. Josh, I hope this is what you expected it would be. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and I will look forward to supporting you and talking to you however best I can do that. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Waters. We are at time, so I don't think we'll have a chance to ask Dr. Waters any questions. I know, I'm sorry. But he is right here. If you want to ask him anything, you can come up and ask him, and you can also send him emails. But we do have to get set up for the next session. So thank you so much, but please come ask him questions if you have them. And join us one more time. Thank you, Dr. Waters.